had a
Adam
client.
again?
No, not no problems with Adam. I told a client that he didn't get the offer. I had 7 offers on a house, and he started threatening the new buyers, saying he was going to make their life a living hell. And I'm like, I don't feel comfortable with this, and I think I need to call the police. And my seller said, yes, please. And they said, we think it needs to come from you because, from me, because he didn't threaten the sellers, even though he was their neighbor. So I called the sheriff's department yesterday. I mean, it's a holiday. Called sheriff's department. He said, I need you to call central dispatch because the phones are recorded. The lines are recorded. So I told them everything, and then the sheriff called me back and spoke with me and took out all of his information and said, thank you so much for calling to alert us of the situation, and we'll be monitoring the neighborhood. And
He wasn't the high bid?
he wasn't the high bid, and then he told me when I called him to let him know that he wasn't the high bid. He's like, I would have went over blankety blank, 50,000 blankety blank. I mean, he was mad. And he.
I've got to let you know, we've got the live stream on, so we
sorry.
need to be careful. I wanted to make sure that it was
Thank you.
Shut live chat off. We're not on the record yet, but
Your live chat was on this morning.
I know I couldn't shut it off. That's why I did it. There's a problem, and so I started and stopped a couple times, and then I just let it go, but it's off now. So.
Good.
All right, we should be ready to start here in about 9 minutes. The parties are logging in right now.
Okay.
Good afternoon, Chief.
Oh, you talking to me?
Yes, you're all squared away. I'll put you in the waiting room.
All right. Thanks, Your Honor.
Okay. All right, we'll be ready to start just in a minute. Is that you, Miss Broker?
It's Ms. Dingman, yes.
Dingman, okay. I'm going to leave you in there. I'm going to mute your microphone, and you can leave your camera off. You'll be able to watch the proceedings.
Okay, thank you.
Good afternoon, Trooper Burgoyes. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, I can.
Okay, we're all set. I'll put you in the waiting room.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I don't know how long it's going to be. I'm not sure what sequence you are, but we should start right at 1, but I'll leave you in the waiting room. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Are you at the post?
No, sir, I'm off today. I'm at home.
Okay, well, thanks for putting your uniform on for us. All right, we'll be with you in just a few minutes. All right, people are lining up. We'll get ready to go here right at 1. There's gonna be a lot of exhibits, I believe. I've only had people in here just a very few times in the last year and a half. We had a case a few weeks ago where someone was here. All right, we're gonna start to bring in the parties. We aren't on the record yet, but again, we are on the live feed.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
Good afternoon. I'm gonna leave you in here.
Okay,
We are on the live feed. We're not on the record yet.
okay.
Hello, booking office. Did anybody bother to tell you guys that we're doing the Dingman prelim at 1 in my court? All right. Yes. All right, thanks. All right, bye. I'm gonna bring Chief Brinker in. I'm assuming he's your officer in charge.
He is.
Detective Males is here from Sturgis. I'll put him in the waiting room.
Okay,
Trooper Elizabeth Burgoy is in the waiting room.
very good.
And good afternoon, Detective Males.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
I'm gonna put you in the waiting room. I'm not sure how long this will be. But we'll know you're here and we've got sound.
Okay.
I'm not sure who this is. Sophia Zabo.
Their sister.
Okay. Good afternoon, Sophia. Can you hear me? Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Can.
All right, this is Judge Middleton. I'm going to mute your microphone and turn off your camera, but you should be able to see, okay?
Okay, thank you.
You have family members that are also here. I'm gonna shorten her name. No one told the jail this hearing was today.
Lori said she secured both Polycom rooms.
Oh, I forgot.
Arraignment rooms, I'm sorry.
Judge Patterson's got the arraignment room, we've got the Polycom room. We have two rooms at the jail that connect, and what you're seeing in the bottom corner is what's called the Polycom room. Judge Patterson's using the other one, so we'll be reserving this one all afternoon. The problem is my corner picture is over it. I wonder if I can move that.
Oh.
Have a seat right there.
Good afternoon, Mr. Weesey. Can you hear me?
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon. Everyone is here. Deputy Herman, I'm going to put you in the waiting room, okay?
Okay.
We'll be back with you. I just wanted you to know you're connected. And I've got Galaxy Note 9. Let's see who this is. that is, I believe, that Jody Hughes? Jody, is that you?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, let me give you a name. All right, I'm going to put you in the waiting room along with the other officers. If you had a deck of cards, you could play electronic euchre somehow, but you're going to be waiting for a while. We'll be back with you, okay?
Okay.
All right, I'm going to turn the record on. This is the time and date for the preliminary examination in the matter of People versus Ethan Nicholas Dingman. Mr. Dingman, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I think it's okay to take your mask off. We've met before. It's been some time. I saw you at the early part of the proceedings, and then Judge Pattison handled some things. I'm here once again. Your lawyer, Mr. Wiese, is here. Amy Shepard, the special prosecuting attorney, is here on behalf of the state. Also present is Chief Mark Brinker from the Colon Police Department, who's the officer in charge of this case. We have a couple of spectators whose cameras are turned off and their microphones are muted, but they're here on representatives of the victim and the defendant, and they're watching. We are live on YouTube, and we are on the Zoom platform, and this is being recorded. We also have several people here in the courtroom. In the waiting room, we have Trooper Elizabeth Burgoyes, Detective David Males of the Sturgis Police Department, Deputy Jody Hughes of the Sheriff's Department, and Deputy Dan Herman of the Sheriff's Department. Mr. Dingman, let me tell you, I told you this months ago, but let me tell you once again, you're charged with open murder, sometimes referred to as the statutory short form murder. It's alleged that November 21st of 2019 in the village of Colon that you did murder Todd Swartz. That is a felony punishable by life imprisonment. The attorneys have done a lot of work in this case up to this date. You spent a number of months at the forensic center and some related hospitalizations. After a lengthy hearing, Judge Pattison issued an order finding that you were competent to proceed to preliminary examination. That order was signed it was filed April 30th. And the matter was set for preliminary examination before me here today. Ms. Shepard, are the people ready to proceed?
Sorry, Your Honor. The one thing I was just sending an email to check is I believed that Dr. Joyce DeYoung should have been in the waiting room as well. We had confirmation from her office that she could participate today, but it doesn't sound like she was currently in the waiting room. I just sent an email to her assistant. Even if she's not in the waiting room right now, we could proceed, yes.
All right. And Mr. Wiese, are you ready to proceed?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right. Now, I don't want to keep mispronouncing your name if I'm saying it wrong. That's how I've been saying it since we met. But how do I say your name? Mr. Wiese?
You got it, Your Honor. Bill Wiese.
All right. Okay, Wiese. That's the way I thought it was. All right. Mr. Dingman, can you hear us?
Yes.
All right. Thank you. Madam Prosecutor?
Thank you, Your Honor. Before we begin with proofs, we do have a few stipulations that I believe we can put on the record. The first is that Dr. Joyce DeYoung, when she does participate and is here, we were stipulating to her testifying as an expert in the field of forensic pathology. So we do not have to go through the initial qualification part during her exam. Secondarily, I have sent copies of People's Proposed Exhibits 1 through 14 to Mr. Wiese. My understanding is that he would stipulate to each of those for the purposes of exam only for their admission at preliminary examination. Finally, we have one more stipulation that the items described in People's Exhibits 13 and 14, the 2 Michigan State Police Crime Laboratory reports, that those are the same items that were recovered from Mr. Dingman during the course of this investigation. The stipulation is for chain purposes, that there wouldn't be a challenge to that. Again, for the purposes only of preliminary examination. I believe that that summarizes the totality of the stipulations that we have at this point.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
We had a failure for a moment. That's never happened before. Mr. Weesey, can you hear me?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, I gotta. Hopefully it didn't disrupt our live chat. Dr. DeYoung is here.
Okay.
Give me just a moment. That's never happened before, to my knowledge. Yes, all right, we're good. All right, secondly, you're going to, for preliminary examination purposes, stipulate to exhibits 1 through 14 of the people, is that correct?
It is.
And thirdly, you will stipulate for preliminary examination purposes only that the items referred to in exhibit 13 and 14 were obtained from the defendant.
That's correct.
Ms. Shepherd, do you wish to make any sort of opening statement or simply proceed with the proofs?
I'd like to just proceed with the proofs, and the first witness that we would call is Dr. Joyce DeYoung.
All right, give me just a moment. Good afternoon. Are you Dr. Joyce DeYoung?
I am. And I was in the wrong courtroom, so I'm sorry that I'm late.
Oh, you're fine.
I ended up with a different
Well, there were
judge.
some changes. You were in Judge Patterson's courtroom the last time. I'm Judge Middleton. We've met over the years. You may not remember me. I was a witness in a Kalamazoo case that involved a 18-year-old homicide that occurred when I was prosecutor. And I may have dealt with you a time or two when I was the county prosecutor.
Sure.
But you're in the right courtroom. And
Okay.
so I'm going to start with asking you to raise your right hand, if you would. Would you state your name for the record?
Joyce Lynn DeYoung,
You spell your last name, please.
DeJong.
You swear or affirm any testimony you're about to give in this matter will be true to the best of your knowledge and belief.
Yes, I do.
Madam Prosecutor?
Thank you. Dr. DeYoung, before bringing you into the Zoom room, we have already stipulated to your expertise in the field of forensic pathology. But if you could please let us know where it is that you work and what it is that you do there.
So I work at the Western Michigan University Homer Stryker MD School of Medicine. I am the chair of the pathology department here. But part of my duties are to serve as a medical examiner for multiple counties in Michigan, including St. Joseph County.
And as part of being the medical examiner for these various counties, including St. Joseph County, is part of your responsibility to perform autopsies on deceased individuals?
Yes,
And is part of that to determine the cause and manner of death for these individuals?
yes,
And is there a standard procedure that you follow to conduct this type of investigation?
yes, there is.
And what's that standard procedure?
The standard procedure is to first gather a little bit of information about the circumstances in which a decedent was found. We then, that's just a routine matter before we actually look at the body. We then examine the body externally, however it's received, whether there's, and if there's clothing, we look at the body, we gather photographs with the clothing and personal effects on. Those are then removed. And the body is examined again without any clothing or personal effects on, and significant findings are noted, features of identification, that type of thing. We'll collect body fluids for toxicologic and sometimes other testing. We then do an internal examination where incisions are made into the chest, abdomen, and the head so that we can see the organs of the neck, chest, abdomen, and the organs and the brain itself. Following that, we'll also do x-rays as indicated. I then take all of the information that's gathered from the examination and I will form that into a report that's issued that documents those findings.
Now, were you employed in this capacity on November 22 of 2019?
Yes.
And in this role as medical examiner, did you perform an autopsy on a Todd Schwartz?
Yes, I did.
And how are you able to identify Mr. Schwartz?
I believe he was identified to us just by a government ID, and then he had tags attached to him that reflected that.
And did you follow the standard procedure that you just outlined in your performing of an autopsy on Mr. Schwartz?
Yes, I did.
And in the course of conducting that evaluation, when you got to the portion of making an examination of his body, did you find any injuries on his person?
Yes, I did.
And what injuries did you find?
So I'll just I'll start at the head and work down, if that makes sense. There was a laceration, which is a break in the skin on the back of his head in the area of the occiput, which is just above the neck, but on the back of the head, there was a laceration in that region. And do you want me to just stick right now to the external injuries, or should we include internal as well?
You can include the internal as well.
Okay, so there was this laceration on the back of his head, the tear in the skin, and there was a lot of hemorrhage of the tissue surrounding that. When we reflected the scalp, we could see that there was significant tissue damage to that area. The skull itself was intact, but there was a bruise on the brain on the opposite side, so the bruise on the brain was actually in the front of the head, which is something that happens. It's something called a contre coup injury. It means that there was a strike to the back of his head and the brain traveled frontwards, and then when it struck the front of the skull, it bruised. So that's a contre coup injury to the front of the brain.
I believe that's French. Could you spell that for
Sure.
them?
I believe it's spelled CONTRECOUP, contre coup.
All right, maybe Latin, but all right, thank you.
Then the other significant findings on the head, including the face and some of the other surfaces like around the eyes, even inside the mouth, were petechiae, a lot of tiny pinpoint hemorrhages that were visible on much of his face and on the mucosal surfaces of the eyes and the mouth. The examination of the neck was significant. On the outside of the neck, there were a number of contusions or bruises and just red erythematous meaning red marks on the outside of the neck.
All right, now I know petechiae, and we can certainly see that. What was the other term you just used?
Erythematous.
You're gonna.
I'm gonna do my best spelling that. erythematous. I believe that's correct. Erythematous. It basically means there's erythema. There is redness on the front of the neck. There were multiple red marks and bruising on the front of the neck. On the inside of the neck, there were injuries. There were areas of bleeding on the inside, and the thyroid cartilage, which is basically the Adam's apple or the voice box. This too had, it was fractured in 3 places. The other significant finding, and I'll group this with the neck because it's part of the exam that we do with the neck, is that we looked at the tongue as well. And the sides of the tongue also had hemorrhages as if he had bitten his tongue on both sides in the back. There was hemorrhage there. On the front of the chest, moving down now, there were multiple bruises on the front of his chest, and then there was actually when we reflect the skin away from the chest, we could see that there was also some hemorrhage beneath these areas as well, between the skin and the sternum and the chest plate as well. Those were the kind of the summary of the injuries that we're seeing.
Based on your expertise, are you able to tell what, I guess let's go back from the beginning of the injuries that you discussed. In regards to this laceration, the part of the body where this located, how much bleeding, if any, would you anticipate to come from that type of laceration?
Well, it was a scalp injury, and the scalp has a lot of blood vessels, and I would expect a fair amount of bleeding to come from that. It was like a full thickness injury, and I'm going to look at my autopsy report a second so that to refresh my memory on how long it was. Yeah, it was 1 3/4 inches long, so a fairly significant tear in the skin, and like I mentioned, I would expect a fair amount of bleeding to come from that.
And then in regards to the hemorrhaging in the skin in that area, what would cause that?
Well, it was a blunt force. The pattern of injury is the pattern that we see when a moving head strikes an object. So that would have been either from a fall or from a shove or being pushed. But when the moving head strikes an object, it will cause this tear in the skin, but then almost simultaneously the bruise to the front of the brain.
Right, and so the Contrecoup injury that you earlier described.
Correct.
And then in regards to the petechiae that you found on the face, in the mucous membranes of the eyes and in the mouth, what would cause that type of injury?
Petechiae can be caused by a number of sources. They're not necessarily specific for example, for a strangulation, but they certainly are oftentimes seen in association with strangulations. So, but other people with women might have facial petechiae during childbirth, just anything that causes significant increased pressure of the vasculature, the blood vessels within within an area, in this case in the head, that would cause these petechiae. So they're small vessels that rupture.
And moving on to then these injuries that you found on the neck, the contusions and bruises and red marks on the neck, were you able to determine what would cause these types of injuries?
Well, those types of injuries, they are also in general a type of blunt force. But in this case, when we're looking at everything and putting everything together, these were blunt force marks, most likely from hands. It didn't, although I can't rule out there wasn't some kind of ligature involved here, but these are injuries to the neck likely from hands.
And would that type of injury be consistent with a strangulation?
Yes.
And in regards to the injuries that you indicated with the thyroid cartilage and the hemorrhages to the tongue, would that also be consistent with a strangulation injury?
The thyroid cartilage fractures are, the tongue not necessarily, no. It's consistent. These tongue injuries are fairly specific for someone biting their tongue, which may occur during a number of scenarios. One of them is just if somebody had a seizure or something, but it'd be from biting their own tongue.
In regards to the multiple bruises and hemorrhaging that you found in the chest area, were you able to determine what might inflict that type of injury?
Well, these are also blunt force injuries. I can't specifically say what caused them, other than there was some blunt force that was applied to the anterior chest wall, and whether, that's about what I can say. Some of them actually look somewhat linear, but I don't know what specifically it was that caused those. They're not specific enough to say, well, this was caused from this particular object, just that they're there.
Based on your examination of Mr. Schwartz in this matter, were you able to form an opinion as to his cause and manner of death?
Yes.
And what opinion did you reach?
So my opinion as the cause of death of Mr. Schwartz was multiple injuries, including strangulation and blunt force.
And was that based on the observations that you made that you've just testified to?
Right, and it's sort of putting everything together.
And when you say strangulation, can you kind of describe what it is, what you mean by that?
Sure. So strangulation really, it's in this case, it's compression of the structures of the neck, resulting in inadequate supply of oxygen to the brain. So by compressing both blood vessels that supply blood to the heart, blocking the blood from returning from the brain, and then also airway compression.
Now, in regards to these blunt force injuries that you've observed, as well as the injuries that were consistent with the type of strangulation, are you able to determine whether they were all inflicted at the same time or if one was inflicted before the other?
They looked consistent with being around the same time. However, in and of themselves, it's not, if I look at the entire picture, including just, we had an investigator out with scene photos and recognizing that, the position that Mr. Schwartz was found in with the blood pooling around his head and these injuries on his neck, I believe he was alive when the head injury, he certainly was alive when the head injury occurred, and he was alive when the neck injuries occurred. So I don't believe that when I look at the totality of everything all the information available, I believe they all were at about the same time. But in and of themselves, if I were only shown the injuries without any other information, one of them could have occurred an hour before, okay, or, an hour more.
Along those lines, if you indicated that just being shown the injuries that you could reach the conclusion that he was potentially alive when these injuries were inflicted, are you able to tell if after these injuries were inflicted, he would be able to cough or move his tongue or anything like that before passing away?
I think, well, if he's dying, could he cough? I'd imagine so, yes. And if he had a terminal seizure, he might bite his tongue during that.
In regards to then, we've discussed now the cause of death. In regards to manner of death, were you able to form an opinion as to that?
Yes.
And what was your opinion?
I like to always qualify this by saying that my opinion on the manner of death is for vital statistics and public health purposes. Our definitions of manner of death are not necessarily related to criminal proceedings, but in this case, my opinion of the manner of death is that this was a homicide.
And when you indicate that it's, for the purposes of vital statistics and that matter, what does homicide mean within that context?
That these were injuries inflicted by another, volitional injuries inflicted by another.
In regards to, and I think this is going to be the end of my questions for now, in regards to the injuries consistent with the strangulation, are you able to tell, based on your training experience, about how long a strangulation would last that leads to that type of injury?
Just through, not through personal experience, but training and reading and the literature, it's quite variable, but certainly more likely in the minutes, like very low minutes to multiple seconds. But when I say multiple, I mean more than 3. So it takes some time. If you simply eliminate blood flow to the brain, for example, and somebody passes out, if you immediately stop, the blood flow will resume and they will come to again. So it does take a period of time.
Thank you. Now, after going through the entire process that you indicated at the very beginning of your testimony, the standard procedure, did you conclude with authoring a report that summarized your findings and your opinions in this case?
Yes.
What I'm going to do is attempt to share my screen. I'm going to show you what's been stipulated to as People's Exhibit 1. Taking a look at that, does this appear to be the report that you authored for this case?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time, I would move to admit the exhibit that's been stipulated as to People's Exhibit 1 into evidence. I have no further questions at this time of Dr. DeYoung.
All right, any objection to admission as the exhibit?
No, Your Honor.
All right, I printed a copy, which we will put Exhibit 1 sticker on it. And so the report of Dr. DeYoung is admitted with its findings as People's Exhibit number 1. Ms. DeYoung, you're still under oath. This is an opportunity for defense counsel to ask you questions as well.
Thank you very much, Your Honor. Doctor, my name is Bill Weesey. I represent Ethan Dingman. As I understand your testimony and your findings of asphyxia due to strangulation and the blunt force injuries to the head, and I certainly understand that obviously Mr. Schwartz was alive when he would suffer the asphyxia due to strangulation as well as the blunt force injury to the head. Are you able to specifically give us your opinion that it was in fact the blunt force injury to the head that was the specific cause of death?
No, it's a combination. I think that, they're both listed there because, and the cause of death itself is listed as multiple injuries, including strangulation and blunt force. So I believe that they both contributed to the death.
If you were able to remove the asphyxia due to the injuries and the asphyxia due to strangulation, is it your opinion that Mr. Schwartz still would have suffered death?
He may have. It's potentially lethal, but it's sort of one of those hypotheticals that's a little bit difficult to answer. it was a serious injury. There was a bruise on the brain in addition to just the significant blood loss from this. But I don't know that he would have died from that.
Okay. Same question inverted. If you were to remove the blunt force injury from the head, would the asphyxiation due to strangulation in and of itself been enough to cause death?
That one I'm a little more confident. If, assuming he dies, okay, that he is dead, you know, and that's all you've had. I think so. I've seen significantly more deaths where we only have strangulation without this blunt force head injury as well, with very similar findings. But it's somewhat uncommon to simply see the scalp injury with the bruise on the brain, although not unheard of. It's more common to find a strangulation without the other findings.
I understand. The injuries to the head of the decedent, would that have been enough, in your opinion, to cause a loss of consciousness upon impact?
It may be.
Are you able to give us any range of probability with respect to that?
I don't know for certain because I don't treat living people. So if you had that scenario, how often is it that somebody has a cerebral contusion that isn't lethal, but they lose consciousness? I believe it would be more likely that you would lose some consciousness, but I don't know the frequency.
You also mentioned the temporal proximity between the asphyxia and the blunt force of the head, and I think you'll find it was potentially an hour, or maybe more accurate to say up to a possibility of up to an hour between those injuries occurring. Is that a fair characterization?
No, I mean, I think when I look at everything in totality, including, you know, we're given I'm provided from my investigator an investigative report and scene photos, and so when I look at everything in totality, it appears to me they most likely all occurred, you know, simultaneously or around the same time, but if I were only looking at the injuries and trying to determine a timing of them based on, say, degree of healing, for example, that's a very imprecise science to say, well, I'm going to take a look at this and look at it under the microscope and see how much healing is here and look at these other things. That's less precise. It could be gapped by hours, more than 1 hour.
Are you able to, can you walk me through the same analysis with respect to just kind of adding or blending in the injury that you described on the front of the chest in terms of temporal proximity?
Yeah, so the injury on the front of the chest, actually, there were some bruises on the front of the chest. There was one of them that actually looked to be, and I'm going to refer to my notes a second just so I get this correct, but there was kind of also it was like more of a yellow abrasion or a yellow scrape on front of the chest, which kind of gives you the impression of something that occurred in the post-mortem period, or, you know, very shortly after death. But the bruises themselves, when we actually see these purple-blue contusions, those look to be something that occurred while alive. But so excluding the one that is more yellow, the scrape on the skin that has more of a yellow coloration to it, those bruises certainly could have occurred around the time in that perimortem period while these other injuries were being inflicted, or they could have occurred earlier by hours as well. And the dating of bruises is really a very difficult task and not something that's accurate whatsoever. So to look at them and say, well, I think these are 5 hours old and the other ones are 2 hours old, that's very imprecise and simply not possible.
And are you able to offer any information or opinion with respect to the time of death?
Time of death. It would take me a moment to look at that to try and sort out when was he last known alive, and when was he found dead? When did we know that Todd Schwartz was alive with certainty, and then when was he found dead? I'd have to sort of extrapolate from that. I'm looking through. By the time it's a little more complicated and not something that I really want to do on the fly.
Sure.
Yeah, given the significance of my opinion here, I don't want to necessarily do that on the fly. Because there were some findings. Yeah.
Fair enough. So if I contact you with follow-up questions off the record as part of the investigation, that's something you'd be able to put together?
I would be able to, I could try. It would most likely be somewhat of a range, but I would certainly try with all the information and evaluations of how much rigor there was. And it's, again, not a very precise science, but I don't want to just say something off the cuff here.
Absolutely. So walk me through quickly the factors in that analysis that you would take into consideration.
Well, I mean, when we're looking at a time of death determination, the first really most important points are when was this person last known to be alive with certainty through a text message or something that we say we're confident he was alive at this point, and then when was he found dead, and if we're trying to narrow it from there, we may be able to narrow it a little bit, depending on how big of a space that is. If it's only 30 minutes, all I can say is he died somewhere in that 30 minutes. We wouldn't be able to narrow that at all. But if it's significantly more time, and we're looking at, when the first responders got there and they were checking him and they found that he, was in full rigor already, we may be able to narrow it somewhat.
Do environmental factors have like temperature have an impact on the degree of rigor?
Yes.
Okay, how so?
Well, it's a heat-driven process, and so if it's warmer, the rigor would develop more quickly. There are a lot of factors that might change how rapidly rigor mortis develops. Then that's just one of the factors. But if it's, so when it's a warm environment, it comes and goes more quickly as opposed to a cool environment where it develops more slowly. So there are those types of factors as well.
Okay. With respect to the report that you authored, it looks like the decedent had amphetamines and or fentanyl in his system. Is that fair to say?
He had methamphetamine and amphetamine in his blood, and his urine had presumptive positives. They didn't confirm that in the urine for amphetamines and fentanyl.
Presumptive positive, but it wasn't confirmed?
Correct.
And can that confirmation still be achieved, or is that something that is no longer able to?
This was from 2019, right? Probably not. Okay. And the urine, it wouldn't necessarily matter. Well, maybe it matters. I don't want to say what matters to you, but in the urine, we typically are more interested in what's in the blood at the time of death, because the urine could be, if it had been in your system and now it's in the urine and you just haven't voided yet, but it's been hours, there may be some significance to that, just to say that, yes, he used fentanyl.
And as part of your analysis, you, on direct and in some of my questions, you referred to looking at photographs. Did you also review police reports and or talk to the investigators?
Yes.
Okay. And do you have any information based upon the totality of your work in this case that the victim was intravenous drug user?
I don't recall that specifically. I guess, you know what, I know that he had a history of heroin use. I don't, I did know that I was told he had a history of heroin use, but I don't know that I was told how he administered that, because sometimes they snort it, sometimes they inject it. So so when I'm saying I'm not sure, it's like, I'm not sure if I was told it was intravenous.
And so, okay, but it sounds like that was something that was told to you as opposed to something that you discovered during the autopsy.
Right.
Okay. And do you have any idea, do you know the source of that information?
Well, mine came to me in the investigative report, and it was actually the investigator on this case was Caitlin Hirsch, and she wrote it in her report that Chief Brinker stated that the decedent had a history of heroin use.
Okay.
All right, let me stop you for a minute. When you're talking about your investigator, you're talking about a medical examiner investigator rather than a police investigator?
Correct.
All right, could you spell her name for us?
Yes, her name is spelled Caitlin is the first name, and her last name is Hirsch, capital Hirsch.
Thank you.
Is the toxicology report something that is separate from your report and the work that you did in this case?
It is.
Okay.
It looks like it's a separate 4-page report.
Is that something that you consult prior to authoring your report?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Your Honor. I believe that's all I have for the doctor.
All right, anything further, Madam Prosecutor?
Just very briefly, Dr. DeYoung, in regards to the methamphetamine that was found in Mr. Schwartz's blood, did you determine that to be a cause of death for him?
I did not.
Thank you. I have nothing further, Your Honor.
All right, Dr. DeYoung, thank you for being here with us
Thank you, Your Honor.
virtually. I'm going to remove you from the queue, and you can go back about your business.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you. All right, who's next?
We would call Trooper Elizabeth Burkhoist.
Remember how to spell your name. Good afternoon, Trooper Burgoyes. Thank you for waiting. They're ready to call you as a witness, so I'm going to ask you if you would please raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm any testimony you're about to give here will be true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, I do.
Would you state your name and spell your last name for the record?
Elizabeth Burgoyes, Bourgeois.
Thank you.
Burkhoist, where do you work?
For the Michigan Department of State Police.
And what do you do for them?
I'm a trooper at the Marshal Post.
And were you working in that capacity on the morning of November 21, 2019?
Yes, I was.
And on that morning, were you dispatched to the village of Colon in St. Joseph County, state of Michigan?
Yes, I was.
And what were you dispatched for?
For a medical call.
And do you remember where it was you were dispatched to?
I believe it was 224 Blackstone.
And did you arrive at that address?
Yes, I did.
And what did you do when you arrived at that address?
I was approached. I had heard Chief Brinker say over the radio he wasn't able to locate the person who made the call or the victim. I was approached by a young man from the direction of the Shell station and asked him if he was the caller.
And in regards to when you arrived on scene, do you know about how long it was after you were dispatched that you arrived?
Within minutes, I was pretty close.
And do you remember about what time that was?
I believe it was around 7 a.m., but I'm not sure the exact timing.
Now, this individual that you were approached by, did you come to know this individual's name?
Yes, ma'am.
And what was that person's name?
Ethan Dingman.
And is Mr. Dingman, or is Ethan Dingman someone you would recognize if you saw again?
Yes.
Do you see that individual on the Zoom screen today?
Yes, ma'am.
And could you identify that individual for the judge by what he's wearing?
He has on glasses and a green and white striped shirt.
Your Honor, may the record reflect the witness has identified the defendant?
It may.
What did Mr. Dingman say when you came in contact with him?
Initially, he didn't say anything. He just stared at me. I had to ask him several times if he was the caller. He eventually acknowledged he was the caller. I asked him where the victim was, and he pointed to a garage nearby.
And what, if anything, did you do when he did that?
I told him to wait by Chief Brinkert's patrol car while I went to assist Chief Brinkert with whatever was going on medically.
Now, when you first came in contact with Mr. Dingman, can you describe exactly where it was that you were and he was?
It was behind the Shell station. There's an alley that runs behind the residences and businesses there. I had pulled into the alleyway, so we were kind of right at the property line between the two.
Was there anyone else on scene besides Mr. Dingman when you arrived?
Just Chief Brinkert.
After speaking with Mr. Dingman and then going and making contact, I'm sorry, I just want to clarify, did you indicate that you made contact with Chief Brinker at that point?
Yes, ma'am.
And so did you enter the garage at that location at that point?
I entered the doorway of the garage.
And what, if anything, did you observe there?
I saw a white male laying on the floor. His legs and arms were straightened at his sides. His head looked like it was laying on a folded piece of cloth, like a pillow maybe. There was blood pooling around his head. I observed some blood footprints and what looked like to be splatter marks in blood.
And after this, were you put in charge of controlling the scene, who was going in and out for evidence purposes?
Yes, ma'am.
Right. Thank you. I have no further questions of you. However, Mr. Weesey may.
Mr. Weesey?
Thank you, Your Honor. Officer, can you hear me okay, Trooper?
Yes, sir. Yes,
Okay.
sir.
My name is Bill Weesey. I represent Mr. Dingman. So first thing I want to do is I want to make sure I've received any report you may have generated. I have a 2-page report, like it was dated on November 22nd, 2019. Is that the one and only report you've generated with respect to this investigation?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And since November 21st of 2019, have you performed any tasks pertaining to the investigation of this case?
No, sir.
You testified on direct that Mr. Dingman approached you. Were you in your squad car? Were you on foot?
I was in my squad car. The first time I saw Mr. Dingman was when I drove in front of the Shell station to turn to go to the alley behind. He was standing at the Shell station doors watching me. By the time I got out of my patrol car, he had approached where I was on foot.
Okay, and would you agree with me that the Shell station and the Schwartz property they're literally, I mean, they're separated by mere feet. Would that be fair to say?
Correct.
Okay. And you described that you had to ask or interact verbally with Mr. Dingman several times. Do you remember how many times? And could you give us more detail on what those interactions between you and Mr. Dingman were?
I don't remember exactly how many times I asked him. I would say at least 2 to 3 times. Mr. Dingman had what I'd probably describe as like a 1,000-yard stare. He was kind of looking at me, but he didn't really seem like he was processing what I was saying to him.
So this wasn't a situation where environmental factors or distance would have impacted, in your opinion or your belief, his opinion to hear you?
Not at all. We were within feet of each other.
Yeah. And so you and Chief Brinker are the only 2 officers on this patrol car?
I'm sorry, sir. Your camera froze. Could you repeat the question?
Sure, yeah. Did you, when you arrived and you came into contact with Mr. Dingman, at that point in time, it was just you and Brinker on scene?
That's correct.
You then directed Mr. Dingman to stand outside or nearby Chief Brinker's patrol car?
Correct.
Okay. And where was Chief Brinker's patrol car in relation to where you parked back in that alley?
It was directly in front of mine.
Okay. But did you advise Mr. Dingman that he was under arrest, or did you advise him specifically that he was not under arrest at this time?
I didn't advise him anything. I just asked him to wait there.
So he wasn't in handcuffs or anything of that nature?
No, he was not.
Did you tell him he was free to leave?
I did not.
Was he free to leave?
Yes.
Okay. But you specifically directed him and caused him to move and to remain outside of Chief Brinker's patrol car.
At the time, I wasn't sure if he responded to or listened to my directive because I had already moved to locate the victim with Chief Brinker. I asked him to stay at the patrol car, but I didn't notice at the time whether or not he listened to me.
Okay. Thank you very much, Trooper. I appreciate your time.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. You can go on about your, well, let me make sure. Ms. Shepherd, do you have any questions for the trooper?
I do not. Thank you, Your Honor.
All right, thank you. Trooper, I'm going to release you from the feed here.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. All right, Ms. Shepherd, who do you have next?
We would call Chief Brinker at this point.
All right. Chief Brinker, good afternoon, sir. Would you please raise your right hand? Do you swear or affirm any testimony you're about to give in this matter will be true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
I do.
Would you state your name and spell your last name for the record, please?
Mark A. Brinkert, Brinkert.
Chief
Thank
Brinker.
you.
Chief Brinker, where do you work?
I work for the Colon Police Department.
And what do you do there?
Currently, I am the Chief of Police.
And was that your role on November 21, 2019?
Yes, it was.
As Chief of Police, do you also conduct patrol and respond to calls for assistance for the Colon Police Department?
Yes, I do.
Right. And were you working on the morning of November 21, 2019?
Yes, I was.
And that morning, did you respond to 224 South Blackstone Avenue in Colon?
Yes, I was dispatched to a medical.
Right. And what's located at 224 South Blackstone?
It's a combination. The lower part is a hair salon, Illusions Hair Salon, and then the second floor is a residence.
And geographically, what is it located close to a Shell gas station?
Yes, it's right next to the Shell gas station. I think there's a fence that goes between the two, but it's only like 3 foot between the Shell building and 224 South Blackstone.
And were you familiar with the owner, the occupant of the property at 224 South Blackstone on November 21, 2019?
Yes,
And who was that?
Todd Schwartz.
And were you familiar with him just contacts in the community?
Contacts through the community. He had his nephew staying with him, and we had a truancy issue, and so I contacted Todd about that. But yeah, just in general.
Now, when you arrived at 224 South Blackstone Avenue, what, if anything, did you do?
They said it was in the garage, so I went around back into the alley. I had trouble locating an entry point. It took me a minute or two. Then I was able to open the walk-in door on the east side of the building, and that's when I saw the decedent.
When you say you saw the decedent, who was it that you saw there?
Todd Schwartz.
And did you recognize him right away?
I recognized him. It wasn't right away because of the color. But yeah, I recognized him as being Todd.
And did you check to see if Mr. Schwartz was responsive at that time?
I checked for a pulse on his left wrist, and he was cold to the touch, and I did not feel a pulse.
And about what time was this?
6:55 a.m. I believe I arrived on scene. I'd have to look at my report, maybe 6:52 a.m.
And after finding Mr. Schwartz inside of the garage, what, if anything, did you do next?
Trooper Boyce came up and said the caller was outside. I asked her to secure the door, and I went and made contact with the caller.
And did you recognize the caller?
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
And who was the caller?
Ethan Dingman.
And was Ethan Dingman someone that you had previous contact with before November 21, 2019?
Yes.
Would you recognize Mr. Dingman if you saw him again?
Yes.
And could you identify him for Judge Middleton by what he's wearing?
Sure. He's wearing the white and green striped uniform, black hair, glasses.
Your Honor, may the record reflect that the witness has identified the defendant.
It may.
And did you attempt to speak with Mr. Dingman when you came in contact with him?
Yeah, when I went back out to my car, he was standing near it, and I asked him, what was going on. And he was difficult to communicate with. It was, like he wasn't hearing me. Sometimes I had to repeat myself.
Did he indicate that he knew who was inside of the garage?
Yeah, as we talked, I asked him, I said, who is it that's in there? And he said it was Todd Schwartz.
And did he indicate to you whether or not he had had contact with Mr. Schwartz while he was still alive that day?
He said, if I recall right, it had been a week since he saw Todd. So no, he did not have any contact, he told me, with Todd that morning until he found him.
And did you ask him if Mr. Schwartz had done anything to harm him or upset him that day?
Yeah, during my interview, I was talking to Ethan, and I asked him if he was upset with Todd. I knew that he had stayed with Todd previously, was no longer staying with Todd, and I just, hey, what happened? Did he do something? Did he make you angry in any way?
And did he respond to that question?
He said no, he was not angry with Todd.
Now, at this point in your conversation with Mr. Dingman, where had that been occurring?
Initially, we were outside my squad car. It began raining a little bit harder, so I had him sit in the front seat of my squad car, and I sat in the driver's seat as I spoke.
Now, at some point, did you leave Mr. Dingman after having a conversation with him in the patrol car?
Yeah, after my initial contact with Ethan. I needed to go back in and get some pictures before it swamped with people. So I asked Ethan to sit in the back seat of my car, which he did, and then I secured my car, making sure that people didn't have access to the driver's compartment and the computer system.
Now, at some point after that, did you come back to your car?
Yes.
And did you have any further contact with or ask Ethan any further questions then?
Your Honor, can I place an objection on the record here?
Yes.
And it's really more of logistics than an objection. I spoke with Ms. Shepard prior to the hearing. Your Honor, what I believe you're going to hear is testimony from Chief Brinker about a number of individual interviews between Chief Brinker and my client. What I would like to do, and I don't believe Ms. Shepard is going to object, is place an objection based upon custodial interrogation, preserve that so I don't have to continue to voir dire and interrupt Ms. Shepard during her examination of the chief, and then preserving it ongoing through my cross-examination of the chief and leaving the matter of admissibility of all of my client's statements up to the court at the conclusion of the chief's testimony, if that makes sense.
Any objection?
Not to that way of proceeding with things, Mr. Weesey, and I did discuss that ahead of time, and we thought that would be the way to be most efficient with the court time this afternoon.
All right, at this point, the defendant is removed from the front seat of the car to the back seat of the car. Now, I assume the difference there, Officer Brinker, is that you can lock him in. Was he locked in the back of the car?
Yes, our squad cars are not equipped, so you can open them to prevent any type of escape or anything.
Like most police cars, you can't open the back seat from the inside.
Yes, sir.
Was he in handcuffs?
No, Your Honor.
Did he have access to the front seat of the car?
No, because there has been issues of people crawling through the security screen and driving off in police cars. I secured the sliding glass divider.
I remember a couple of those. Was he told he was under arrest?
No, he was not under arrest at that time.
He was not told he was under arrest, then as far as you're concerned, he was not?
No, sir.
Was he free to leave?
I'm going to say yes if he would have said something, but since we didn't cross that path, I can't.
All right,
Yeah,
so
he could have. At some point, yes, he probably would have been able to leave, but that never came up.
all right, Ms. Shepard, why don't you pick up from there?
Thank you. Now, at some point, did you return to your car in order to, this is after the first contact that you had with him, did you come back to your car in order to type a search warrant for the premises?
Yes, I did.
And without going into specifics, were you engaging with conversation with Mr. Dingman at that point in your patrol car?
Yes, I was.
All right. And then after that, did you leave the car again at some point?
Yes. We started getting numerous calls from potential witnesses. And so he was placed in the back of Deputy Bingman's or Corporal Bingman's squad car while I left the scene to go talk to people.
Now, at some point, did you have an opportunity to ask him about how far, if at all, he had gone into the garage that morning?
Yes, I did.
Do you remember when that was? Was it the first conversation you had with him or the second conversation or at some other time?
I believe it was the first conversation.
And what did he indicate to you?
if I remember correctly, without looking at my report, he said that he opened the door and saw Todd there. He might have took a step in to the garage area, and then he stepped back out. He didn't like what he saw.
Did you ask if he had touched Todd at all?
Yes, I did.
And what did he say?
He said no.
And then at some point, was Mr. Dingman transported to the St. Joseph County Sheriff's Department for a voluntary statement?
Yes.
Who did the transport?
I did.
Okay. Approximately what time did that happen?
Oh, let's see. My timeline's going to be tough. At about 8:45 a.m. is when I transported him to the Sheriff's Department.
Now, did you ever ask Mr. Dingman if he knew who had harmed Mr. Schwartz?
Not a direct question like that. I asked him who was mad at Todd, who would have hurt Todd this way. And he said he didn't know, that he doesn't believe anybody would hurt him that way.
Throughout the entire time that you were having contact with Mr. Dingman, did his demeanor change at all? Did it remain the same?
Pretty much remained the same, very low key. He was not excited. He talked in a low tone. At times it was hard to hear him or understand him.
Now, at some point, did you check Mr. Schwartz's house to see if it was locked?
Yes, I did. And the doors were locked.
At some point, were keys located for the house?
There were keys that were located in the yard between the rear of the house and the garage area.
And speaking of Mr. Schwartz, were you able to observe the condition of the clothing that he was wearing when he was there on the floor of the garage?
A quick note, yeah.
Okay, were you able to take note of whether or not the pockets of his clothes were inside or outside or anything else?
I believe the pockets were inside, but there was a large tear in the blue jeans he was wearing near the pocket area.
Now, in the course of your assisting or conducting the investigation for this case, did you come to find that Mr. Schwartz had worn a round pair of glasses?
Yes. In talking with his best friend, his brother, and his co-worker, I showed them a photo of a pair of glasses, and all believed those were an old pair of glasses, that he was currently wearing square type glasses.
So I want to back up there a little bit. At some point, did you receive a photo from a family member of Mr. Schwartz wearing a particular pair of glasses?
Yes.
And would you recognize that photo if you saw it again?
Yes, I would.
All right. And what I'm going to do is attempt to share my screen. I'm going to show you what's been stipulated to as People's Exhibit 2. Do you recognize this photograph?
Yes, I do.
And is that the photograph that you received of Mr. Schwartz wearing these glasses in question?
Yes, it was.
Thank you.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
The photo looked like it was in front of a Christmas tree of the decedent wearing round glasses is admitted.
Thank you, Chief Brinker.
I'm sorry.
Thank you, Chief Brinker. I don't have any further questions for you at this point, but Mr. Weesey will.
All right, thank you. You're still under oath.
Yes, sir.
Good afternoon, Chief.
Good afternoon.
So on the day of question here, you were wearing a body cam unit,
Yes, sir, I was.
and all of your interactions and activities that day have been captured on body cam footage.
Not all of my interactions, no.
Did you review the body cam footage that we do have prior to testifying in court this afternoon?
No, I did not. I reviewed my report.
Okay. So what time did you arrive on scene?
I'll go back to my report. It shows that I was dispatched at 6:51 a.m. and I arrived at 6:52 a.m. So I was a minute out.
Okay. And if I suggested to you that according to the body cam video, your initial interview of Mr. Dingman began at 6:55 and 24 seconds, would you have any reason to dispute that?
No, I have no reason. I don't believe I activated my body cam when I first got out of the car.
Sure. I've had it in jurisdictions where there's like technical glitches or something, and the time that shows up on footage might be an hour off or something of that nature. But
no, that sounds about right.
Okay, so you would have been on scene for 5 minutes by the time you initially began, or so, before you began your initial conversation with
3
Mr.
minutes,
Dingman.
yeah.
3 minutes.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
If it's 6:55.
Okay. And that video, if I were to suggest to you that video ends at 7:22 and 56 seconds, any reason to dispute that?
No.
Okay. And that time would encapsulate the time when you had Ethan outside of your car and you had that first conversation with him, and then you left the car to go take crime scene photographs. Fair to say?
Right.
Okay. And during that time frame, as I understand your testimony on direct examination, you asked him if Mr. Schwartz had done anything to make him mad, and you asked him when the last time you saw him, and it was about a week ago. And then you asked him, do you know who did this? And Ethan said no. Does that basically summarize that conversation?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And the only thing really above and beyond that was an incredibly brief conversation about the light being on in the garage and Ethan having pushed open the door. Fair to say? Okay. And again, I mean, the video begins at 6:55. At 7:11 and 14 seconds, you had Mr. Dingman get in the rear seat of your patrol car. Any reason to dispute that?
No, I have no reason to dispute that, sir.
Okay, so we've got less than 5 minutes and we're going from the front of the seat to the back of the seat. And at that point in time, at 7:11:14, you asked Mr. Dingman to remove a pair of gloves he had been wearing.
Yeah.
And at that point in time, Ethan was not wearing any eyeglasses, fair to say?
No, he had no glasses on.
Okay. And what happens next is you get out of your car, you leave Ethan in the car, and you go and you have a conversation with Super, I'm going to mispronounce her name.
Bruises.
Rigor. Fair to say?
Yeah.
And at that point in time, what you say to Trooper Bruises is, I got my guy. I'm not 110%, but I got my guy. Fair to say?
Not those words.
Not those words. What words would you use as your memory of that conversation?
I believe I said, I've got the suspect. I'm not 110% sure.
Okay. Okay. So, and at that point in time, Ethan is in the rear of your patrol vehicle as you go conduct an investigation.
As I took pictures, yes, sir.
Okay, and again, you've been on scene for essentially 20 minutes.
Okay.
Fair to say?
I will trust you.
Okay. Well, does that jive with your memory?
Yeah.
Okay. And during this initial conversation, would it also be fair to say that there were points in time when Ethan would volunteer random and bizarre, nonsensical statements? For example, out of the blue in that initial conversation, might say, you know, I haven't been able to talk to my mom in a long time.
Yes.
Okay. And did that cause you any concern with respect to Mr. Dingman's mental capacity?
It caused me concern as, was he under the influence of something? Was something going on? Did something traumatic just happen that he's acting this way? Yes.
Okay, and you small town there, you had some, and I believe you've already testified that you knew Ethan to some extent, some degree prior to this morning?
Yes.
Knew he was kind of a homeless person who bounced from location to location?
I did not know he was homeless. I know he would go from place to place.
Okay.
Can I say something?
No,
Your
give me an
Honor,
opportunity. You want me to mute that mic?
please.
If I mute it, it's difficult for him to unmute it, but I will do that. We might need assistance. Ethan, for your own protection, we're gonna mute your mic, and then if we need to talk to you, we'll ask the deputy to unmute it. Thank you.
So, Chief, after the first interaction with Mr. Dingman, is that when you typed the search warrant, or is that when you went and took photographs, or did you do both?
I went and took photographs of the scene at that time. When I returned to my car is when I started typing a search warrant.
Okay. And
Let me stop there for just a moment. And this may not be clear, but you have a laptop computer in your car which is connected to networks, and you can use the word processor to type a search warrant and then email it or electronic fax it to the magistrate.
That is correct, Your Honor.
And is that what you were doing?
I was starting that process, yes.
Right from the laptop in your car?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay.
did you have anything else, Your Honor?
No, it's just a long time from when police officers used to knock on my door in the middle of the night to help with the search warrant. And we drive to the magistrate's house. Now everything's done electronically and there are laptops in the car.
Yeah. Okay, so Chief, was your activities when you're taking the photographs, is that part of the time frame that your camera was not on?
My camera, I turned off, I believe, when I took the photographs.
Okay. Okay. Do you know how long you spent taking photographs?
Probably a minute. It was just a quick overview of the scene.
And I'm sorry, did you say a minute or 8 minutes?
1 minute.
Okay, thank you. Okay. So then you come back to your car and Mr. Dingman is seated in the rear seat, yes?
Eventually. Life care ambulance showed up on scene. The fire department showed up scene. So I had quick interaction with them before I got back to my squad car.
And by quick interaction, really what you said was, hey, no need, folks, you guys can go about your day.
Yes.
So then you went back to your car and Ethan is in the back seat. At that point in time, did you read the Miranda warnings to Mr. Dingman?
No, I did not.
Did you tell him he was free to leave at any time?
No, I did not.
Did you obtain any type of consent for him to make a voluntary statement?
Just the fact that I asked a question and he would answer.
Okay,
So
but some officers have those consent checklist forms that they
Right.
go
No,
through.
I did not.
Okay. And why the need to go back and continue the conversation with Mr. Dingman at that point in time?
Honestly, I was trying to find out why he was there. Why did he find Todd?
So you're specifically in your mind, is he in custody at that point in time?
No.
And why wouldn't he? You hesitated there. Why did we hesitate, and why in your mind is he not in custody?
At that time, I was still conducting an investigation. I was interviewing Ethan. Yes, he was in custody because he was in the back seat of my car. Had he protested, we would have dealt with it at that time.
I heard, yes, he was in custody because he's in the back seat of my car.
Yes,
and
sir.
to be clear, he cannot get out of the back seat of your
No,
car.
sir.
Right. Okay. And earlier in the conversation here this afternoon, I think the judge asked you if at some point in time would he have been free to leave. Your answer was probably at some point in time if he would have asked.
Yes.
Okay. Well, if Mr. Dingman says I'm going to open up the car door here at this point in time, I'm going to leave. Is it your testimony is that you would have allowed him to do that?
Speculation, yes.
Speculation.
Because
okay.
we never got to that point.
Okay. But he's in custody, and you moved him from the front seat to the back seat, and he can't open the back seat, and he's a suspect, and you clearly indicated at that point, at that time, at the end of that first conversation, you said, I have my suspect, I'm not 110% sure.
Yep.
All of this is fair to say, right? This is all accurate?
Yes.
Okay. And then you go back to him specifically to interrogate him with respect to the events of that morning.
Ask questions, yes.
Okay. And that conversation lasts until about 7:41 and 22 seconds, fair to say?
Fair to say, without looking at the video and the timeline on there, yes.
Yep. And at that point in time, you again go and reconvene with the other investigating officers, fair to say?
To the officers arriving at the scene, yes.
And at that point in time, what you say to these other officers is, wow, Ethan isn't making any sense at all. Is that fair to say?
Yep. Yes.
And did you, and again, this is you and the officers talking, outside the presence of Mr. Dingman, did you have a conversation with the officers about the decedent in this case being homosexual?
Yes.
Did you have conversation about the decedent in this case possibly having sex with kids that he let stay there for room and board?
I don't believe I used the word kids.
Words to that effect.
To people, yes.
Okay. And then the medical examiners begin to show up and you say, okay, we don't need you. And then you go on to state in this meeting with officers that this suspect is really out of his mind or is just a dumbass. Fair to say?
I don't remember using those terms.
Okay, but would it be fair to say that that based upon your your statements after having very recently interacted with Mr. Dingman, that you were concerned about his mental capacity?
Yes.
And then at 7:43 and 49 seconds, you go back to the car again to talk to Ethan, right?
Could be, yes.
No reason to dispute that?
No.
Okay. And you begin to, and again, before questioning Mr. Dingman again, absolutely no Miranda warning.
I did not.
Absolutely no, you're free to leave.
Nope.
Absolutely no consent form or anything going over getting his explicit agreement to discuss anything with you.
No.
And after your third interview, and by the way, in that third conversation, Mr. Dingman says, hey, I didn't have anything to do with this, correct?
That is correct.
And at that point in time, you transported Ethan to the jail to be interviewed by Detective Sergeant Chad Spence and Detective Dave Males.
Yes, sir, I did.
I'm getting a signal across my computer, everyone, that my internet connection is maybe being disrupted. If you guys lose me, somebody get my attention, please. Chief.
Okay, it's been okay. We've had a glitch or two, but we're doing okay.
Okay.
We're going to take a break here shortly. I think probably the defendant could use one, but go ahead.
And before you transported Ethan to the jail, did you advise him he was placed under arrest?
No, I told him we wanted to do a videotaped interview with him.
Okay. Did you? And then you took him to the jail and then that's when you passed him off to the other officers for continued interrogation?
For them to do their interview, yes, sir.
Okay. Would it be fair to say that in the second interaction with Ethan and the third interaction with Ethan, he continued to make statements that were just completely nonsensical?
Yes, he made random statements.
Okay. And one of which was something about his dad having passed away in the alleyway.
Yes, sir.
After and other examples would be he was having something about, boy, when I was 18, that year went by really fast.
That's correct. He did state that.
Another random, nonsensical, bizarre statement. Ethan says, I'm a pretty good cards player.
Yes, he did say that.
Okay. Subsequent to Ethan arriving at the sheriff's department, did you go back to the scene and do a search of the home?
I went back to the scene. I was not part of any of the searches. That was left to the St. Joe County Major Crime Task Force and the State Police Lab team.
Okay, and you've been able to hear the testimony, or you heard the testimony of Dr. DeYoung, where she indicated that she had some conversations with officers, and I believe she believes them to be you, that made statements as to Mr. Schwartz being a drug user. Did you make those statements?
I made a statement to Caitlin Hirsch, the MEI, that it was crack cocaine, not heroin.
Okay. And what did you base that statement on?
Nothing with evidence, just the rumor mill of a community that I've been in.
Fair to say, and I appreciate the candor of the answer. Same thing about pertaining to Mr. Schwartz and engaging in homosexual sex?
It was known that Todd was gay, yes.
Okay. And evidently, or eventually, there were a lot of drug components found on the person of Mr. Schwartz and within the home, within the Schwartz home?
Yes.
And it would have included pipes in his pockets to ingest methamphetamine?
I believe so, but I can't say 100% sure, but I believe so.
And we also had what was essentially a one-pot meth lab that was discovered in the home.
That is correct.
And all of this was done either while Ethan was being talked to at the jail and or after that point in time.
That is correct.
Fair to say. What follow-up with respect to your investigation did you yourself partake in? After you transported Ethan to the jail, what, if anything, did you do pertaining to this investigation?
I talked to other witnesses, people at the Shell station.
To your knowledge, was any physical evidence retrieved or located from the Shell station?
That I don't believe so. But again, I believe the State Police Laboratory team handled the Shell station.
Okay. Your Honor, if I can just have a moment to review my notes.
Certainly.
Your Honor, thank you. I have nothing further at this time.
Any redirect?
Very briefly, Chief Brinker, when you told Ethan that you wanted to take him to get a videotaped interview of him, how did he respond to that?
I believe, he didn't say no. He didn't say I didn't want to go. And so, I took it that he went willingly.
Thank you. I don't have any further questions.
All right, we're going to take a break. I'm going to stop the record. I'm going to leave the live feed on. So you've had trouble with the chat function. The clock doesn't work here. We'll take about a 10-minute recess and try to resume at 2:45. Mr. Dingman, I'm going to ask the officers to let you take a short break, and we will resume here in about 10 minutes.
Thank you, Your Honor.
The power went out here in the courthouse on Thursday for several hours, so all the clocks are all out of whack, but, and it's 2:36 by the computer clock. So we'll be back here in just a moment. Ms. Shepherd, do you know who your next witness is?
Yes, it would be Deputy Hughes.
All right. Deputy Herman and Detective Males, I'll just give you an update. We took a brief break. I'm going to put you back in the waiting room. Don't go away. And Deputy Herman in the waiting room. Deputy Hughes, I'll leave you here on this side. Welcome back, Mr. Dingman. We're going to have that phenomenon again about 4 o'clock where the Zoom wants to shut off because we've been on for 9 hours, so we'll have to keep an eye on that. All right, it's 2:45. We took a very short break. I appreciate everybody's quick turnaround time. I will let you know I'm available all morning tomorrow if we need to continue this beyond this afternoon. The parties have rested their questioning of Chief Brinker. I understand the next witness will be Deputy Joseph Hughes. All right, Deputy Hughes, could you please raise your right hand? Do you swear or affirm any testimony you're about to give here will be true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
I do.
I'll let you know as well, we're live on YouTube, we're on the Zoom platform, and everything is being recorded. Ms. Shepherd? Oh, first of all, would you state your name and spell your last name for the record?
Deputy Joseph Hughes, Hughes.
Thank you.
Deputy Hughes, where do you work and what do you do there?
I work for the St. Joseph County Sheriff's Department, and I'm a deputy.
Were you working as a deputy on November 21, 2019?
Yes, I was.
And were you called into the Sheriff's Department's headquarters that morning?
Yes, I was.
And why were you called in?
To work with the Major Crime Scene Task Force.
Did you end up assisting with a homicide investigation that day?
Yes, ma'am.
And what was your role in assisting with the investigation?
To assist Detective Sergeant Spence with collecting the clothing from Ethan Dingman.
And did you make contact with Ethan Dingman that day?
Yes, I did.
Is he someone that you would recognize if you saw again?
Yes, I would.
And do you see him on the Zoom screen this afternoon?
All I see are you and I.
Oh.
You have to slide to the right.
Slide?
You're on a
Okay.
phone, apparently.
Are you able to manipulate the screen back and forth to see other participants in the
Yeah.
call? And do you see Mr. Dingman among the participants?
Yes, I do.
And could you tell the judge who he is by what he's wearing?
He's wearing green and white striped shirt.
Your Honor, may the record reflect that the witness has identified the defendant?
It may.
Now, in coming in contact with Mr. Dingman in terms of this, what your role that day, where was he very cooperative with you?
At times, and at other times, no. So yes and no.
And did you end up documenting different things that day, such as taking photos of his clothing?
Yes, I did.
And did you also end up collecting his clothing that day?
Yes, I did.
And was that pursuant to a search warrant?
Yes.
And what did you do with the clothing once collected?
They were photographed and placed in evidence bag, labeled and entered into the system.
Among that clothing, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Actually, they were photographed, packaged, and then turned over to Colon Police Department. I believe they entered them into the system.
Now, among the items that you collected, did you collect a pair of shoes from Mr. Dingman?
Yes, I did.
Did you collect a pair of pants from his person?
Yes, I did.
And a shirt that he was wearing?
Yes, I did.
And did you also document a pair of glasses?
Yes.
And a banana?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay. And you also end up taking swabs from Ethan?
Yes.
And what type of swabs were those?
They were sterile swabs with distilled water of his hands, and then buccal swabs of the inside of his mouth on both sides of his cheek.
Did you ultimately take the evidence that you collected and transport it to the Colon Police Department yourself?
Yes, I did. Well, to the scene where the crime scene was, and I turned it over where all the other evidence was.
Now, I'm going to share my screen in just a second here with what have been stipulated to as People's Exhibits 3 through 11. I guess I'll let you look at each one when you're done looking at it. If you could just say done, and we'll flip through them each that way, and then I'll have a question for you at the end of them. So if you could just look at them long enough to see if you understand what it is, and then we'll go through each one like that. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So this is what's been stipulated to as People's Exhibit 3.
Okay, done.
People's Exhibit 4.
Done.
People's Exhibit 5.
Done.
People's Exhibit 6.
Done.
People's Exhibit 7.
Done.
People's Exhibit 8.
Done.
People's Exhibit 9.
Done.
People's Exhibit 10.
Done.
People's Exhibit 11.
Done.
Thank you. Did you recognize each of those exhibits?
Yes, I did.
And were those photographs that you took in the process of assisting with the investigation on November 21, 2019?
Yes, they were.
Your Honor, at this point, I would move to admit to those stipulated exhibits. I have no further questions for Deputy Hughes.
May they be admitted? Mr. Weesey? All right, number 3 appears to be a photo of the defendant wearing some pants. You can see his socks. Number 4 is a photograph of a banana. Number 5 is a photograph of shoes. Number 6 is a photograph of the bottom of the shoes. Number 7 is one shoe. Number 8 is a pair of glasses. Number 9 is a pair of glasses. Number 10 is a photograph of some brown pants laid out on the ground. And number 11 is a plaid flannel shirt. Exhibits 3 through 11 are admitted. Thank you.
And I have no further questions for Deputy Hughes.
All right. Mr. Weese, any questions?
Yes, thank you. Deputy Hughes, the items that we just went through, you collected those as an evidence technician?
Yes, sir.
And can you describe for us the training and experience you have with respect to collecting forensic evidence?
My training and experience.
Yeah.
I guess I don't understand what you're asking.
If you don't have.
Mr. Weese, we're kind of losing you a little bit. Well, are you a evidence technician for the Major Crimes Task Force?
Yes, I am.
All right. Did you receive any training to give that position?
Yes, I have.
All right. What is it?
Crime scene evidence collection and processing, photographing.
Is that a course?
It was a class that was put on up in Lansing that the department sent us to.
Anything else?
Other than working on scenes, and we do training or attempt to do training through the months, but with the COVID, that's been kind of hard to do. But, you know, we do training with the other departments as far as, you know, fingerprinting, evidence packaging, photographing, scene processing. So we do training.
Okay. And can you hear me now? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Can you describe the steps that you took in this case to ensure that you protected the integrity of the evidence or the items that you collected? For example, did you wear gloves? Was refrigeration used or any additives used? Any steps at all that you took to preserve the integrity and the materials that you collected?
The gloves were used. The clothing was taken off by Mr. Dingman, handed to me, and I placed them directly into the evidence bag. The items were placed in their own bags. When I went to photograph them, I did lay a sheet of paper out and set them on there while I was photographing them, as to not collect anything on them. Then the items were placed back inside the bags and sealed.
Do you recall the sequence of the items that you went through? The shoes, then pants?
No, I do not recall the
Would
sequence.
you have used, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Do you know if you would have used a fresh sheet of paper that you described between each and every item?
That I don't recall if I did. I you normally would to protect but I can't remember if that happened.
Okay. Do you recall if you put on a fresh pair of gloves in between each of the individual items as you dealt with them?
No, I did not put new gloves on.
Okay. And this was all done at the county jail down there?
At the sheriff's department.
Oh, sheriff's department, okay.
Yeah.
And who was it that put you in contact with Mr. Dingman? Was it Chad Spence, and or Dave Males?
Detective Spence, Detective Males was in the interview room with him.
So was this before those two named officers interviewed Mr. Dingman or after that interview?
That I do not know.
Were you present when Mr. Dingman first arrived?
No, I was not.
At the sheriff's drive? Was there a conversation between you and the other officers about Ethan having been placed under arrest?
I don't recall having any conversation about that.
Okay. And I don't believe, you correct me if I'm wrong, but it doesn't sound like you have any independent knowledge that your activities took place after their conversation with Mr. Dingman.
I don't know when they spoke to him. I was just, when I showed up, when Detective Spence told me to go ahead and start doing the process, that's when I began. I don't know if they had talked to him prior or
okay.
I'm assuming they did, but I have no knowledge of that. You would have to ask them.
Yep, absolutely. So what did you do with the items that you collected upon your securing them?
Can you repeat? You were broken.
The items after collecting them from Mr. Dingman and photographing them, where did you take them?
After they were packaged and sealed, I transported them over to the crime scene, to our crime scene trailer, and they were put with the rest of the evidence to be taken to turned over to the Colon Police Department.
The crime scene trailer, where was that located?
At the crime scene.
So these items went back to the crime scene. Okay. And then did you stay with the items or what did you do next?
I stayed in the trailer until I was advised I could leave.
And eventually Chief Rickard or someone advised you that your services were no longer needed, and that concluded your participation in this investigation?
Correct.
And since that date and time, have you done anything else with respect to this case? Any other investigation?
With this case, no.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Anything further, Ms. Shepherd?
No, thank you, Your Honor.
All right, Deputy Hughes, thank you. I'm going to remove you from the feed. You're free to go.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Losing my voice. I'm not even doing most of the talking here. Who's your next witness?
Deputy Daniel Herman.
All right. Good afternoon, Deputy Herman. Thank you for waiting for us. You've been here for 2 hours. But it's time to take your testimony. I'm going to ask you if you would please raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm any testimony you're about to give in this matter will be true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
I do.
Would you state your name and spell your last name for the record, please?
Deputy Dan Herman. Herman.
Thank you.
Deputy Herman, where do you work and in what capacity?
I work for the St. Joseph County Sheriff's Department. I am a road patrol deputy.
And were you working as a road patrol deputy on November 21, 2019?
It was actually my day off, but I was employed as such on that day.
Did you end up getting called in to assist with an investigation that day?
I did.
And were you given a variety of tasks to assist with the investigation once you responded?
I was.
And was it 224 South Blackstone Avenue in Colon, Michigan that you were called into?
Yes.
Now, was one of the tasks that you were given that day to identify potential evidence inside of the home of Todd Schwartz?
Yes.
And is that what is located at 224 South Blackstone Avenue?
Yes.
And at some point, did you go into the kitchen of that residence?
Yes, I did.
And did you locate some bananas inside that residence?
Yes, I did.
All right. Where did you locate them?
They would have been on the kitchen counter.
And do you remember, what color they were, if they were fresh, ripe, overripe bananas?
I don't recall.
Now, do you remember whether or not you documented what those bananas looked like that day?
I did not document that.
You remember
the freshness?
You remember taking photographs that day?
I did not personally take photographs. I believe Officer Watson took photographs.
Would looking at a photograph from the scene that day help refresh your recollection?
Yes.
I'm going to share my screen and show you what's been stipulated to as People's Exhibit 12. Right. Do you see the photograph there?
Yes.
And does it refresh your recollection?
Yes.
Does the photograph depict the bananas that you saw on scene that day?
Yes.
And would you say that fairly and accurately represents what you saw while you were there?
Yes.
Thank you. Your Honor, I have no further questions of Mr. Herman and would move to admit People's Exhibit 12 at this point.
No objection.
All right, Exhibit 12, which appeared to be a picture of a kitchen counter with a number of items, including some bananas, is admitted. All right, Deputy Herman, that was your reason to be here. I'll excuse you. Oh, wait a minute, I'm sorry.
Mr. Weese may have some cross-exam questions.
Oh, I'm sorry. I jumped the gun there. Thank you.
I'll be very quick, Deputy Herman. Thank you.
Oh, take as much time as you want. I just skipped a step.
I'm easy to pass over, Your Honor. So, Deputy Herman, you conducted a search of the residence on is it Blackstone?
Yes.
Okay. And part of that search, you went up to what you knew as the decedent's bedroom.
Yes.
And within that bedroom, you either found and/or seized 10 different pieces of evidence pertaining to drug use.
Yes.
Could you describe those real quick for us?
We located several methamphetamine pipes, as well as the actual product of methamphetamine. And then inside the closet, we located trash bags that were full of one-pot meth labs.
Actual working meth labs?
None of them, I don't believe any of them were active. I believe they were all old.
Okay. And at that point in time, the scene actually had to be cleared for safety reasons?
Yes.
And did you also find evidence of meth lab or meth use in the adjacent garage?
I believe they located pipes on the victim. but I don't believe there was any other
Okay,
evidence in the garage.
okay. And did you also do a search of a church?
Of the exterior of a church, yes.
Okay, was anything taken from that location? See,
Yes, there was several, like a trash bag and duffel bag full of clothing that was believed to belong to the suspect.
can you do me a favor and yell at me? I'm having a hard time hearing you.
There was like a couple trash bags and like a duffel bag that were full of like clothing and items that were believed to belong to the suspect.
And this is a church that was allowing Mr. Dingman to stay there from time to time? Is that your understanding?
Yes, so they had like a covered porch that he would sleep under the roof of, and they allowed him to do that as long as there was no activities going on at the church.
Real quick, is this like a room? Is it enclosed? Is it
It's not enclosed. It's open. Like you go up the stairs, and then it's covered with a roof, but it's before you enter the door of the church.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much, officer. I appreciate your time.
Yes, sir.
All right, sorry about that. Anything further, Ms. Shepherd?
No, thank you, Your Honor.
All right, Deputy Herman, I'll release you from the feed as well. The only one we have left is Detective Males. Is that who you wish next?
Yes, please.
Good afternoon, Detective Males. Thank you for your patience. They're ready to ask you some questions now under oath. Would you please raise your right hand? Do you swear or affirm any testimony you're about to give in this matter will be true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
I do.
Would you state your name for the record and spell your last name?
Detective David Males, M-A-L-E-S.
Thank you.
Detective Males, where do you work and what do you do there?
I work at the Sturgis Police Department and I am the detective.
And in the course of your employment as a detective, do you from time to time assist other departments with investigations in their jurisdictions?
I do.
On November 21, 2019, were you working as a detective for the Sturgis Police Department?
I was.
And on that day, were you called to assist with a potential homicide investigation in Colon, Michigan?
Yes.
And where did you respond to?
We responded to 224 South Blackstone Street in the village of Colon.
And was that on the day of November 21, 2019?
That's correct.
Did you assist with any of the investigation on scene that day?
No.
At some point, did you ultimately travel to the St. Joseph County Sheriff's Department to help with obtaining a statement?
I did, yes.
And who were you obtaining that statement from?
Ethan Dingman.
Mr. Dingman, someone you would recognize if you saw again?
Yes.
Do you see multiple people on the Zoom screen right now?
I do.
All right. Do you see if Mr. Dingman is one of the individuals on the Zoom screen?
He is. He's wearing green and white striped shirt.
Your Honor, if the record reflects that the witness identified the defendant.
It may.
Thank you. Now, while still on scene at 224 South Blackstone, was Mr. Dingman there?
He was in the backseat of a patrol car.
And in terms of him being transported to the St. Joseph County Sheriff's Department, did you believe that he was doing that voluntarily?
Yes.
And what led you to believe that?
I was told that he wanted to give a voluntary statement.
Now, were you present for the entire interview at the Sheriff's Department?
I was.
And in the course of that interview, was he asked whether he attempted to help Mr. Schwartz when he found him inside the garage?
Yes, he was.
And how did he respond?
He stated.
Just a minute. What room was this interview conducted in?
In the interview room at the St. Joe County Sheriff's Department.
Who was present?
Myself and Detective Chad Spence.
And Mr. Dingman,
Yes, that's correct, Your Honor.
was it recorded?
It was recorded.
Before you began this questioning, was the defendant advised of his Miranda rights?
Not at the start of our interview, he was not. My understanding was that he was a witness and that he was giving a voluntary statement.
Your understanding from who?
From Chief Brinker and the officers on scene.
Where did they tell you that?
I stated that Ethan had made the 911.
No, where did they tell you that?
Oh, on scene in Colon.
All right, was the defendant taken back to the sheriff's department in Officer Brinker's patrol car?
I believe so, yes.
Did he come in through the front door, or did he come in through the Sally Port door at the jail?
I do not know. By the time I arrived, he was already inside.
Now, the St. Joe County Sheriff's Department is divided into two halves. There's the jail half and the administrative half. Which side of the building were you in?
The administrative portion.
So there were no bars or steel doors or that sort of thing?
That's correct.
But the doors are locked, are they not?
The door to the interview room is not locked from the inside or outside. And on the administrative side, once you're inside of the building, you can freely get out.
All right, thank you. They're locked to get in, but unlocked to get out?
Correct.
All right, I'm sorry. So you and Officer or Detective Spence sit down with him. What time is this?
I arrived on scene about 8:15. I would say 9:30-ish. I don't recall the exact time frame.
All right, thank you. You may proceed with questions, Ms. Shepherd.
Thank you. Detective Mills, did you question Ethan as to whether he attempted to help Mr. Schwartz?
Yes, we did.
And what did he say?
He stated he did not render any aid to Mr. Schwartz, that there was a lot of blood and he didn't want to touch it.
Now, did you ask him why he called 911 from a Shell gas station?
Yes, we did.
And what did he indicate?
He said that his phone did not have any power.
And when you say his phone, would that be like a cellular phone?
Correct, yes.
What was his demeanor during the course of the interview with you and Sergeant Detective Spence?
It ranged from non-emotional, very flat, to very agitated and aggressive towards myself and Detective Sergeant Spence.
In the course of having this conversation with you, did he indicate what position Mr. Schwartz was in when he came in, when Mr. Dingman entered the garage?
It depends on which version of his story we talk about. The first time he told us that when he found Mr. Schwartz, he was on his side.
So did his version of events change over the course of your interview with him?
Yes, it did, approximately 4 times.
Now, at some point during the interview, did he ask to contact his attorney?
He did, yes.
And did you offer assistance in having him contact his attorney?
We did, yes.
Yeah, and how was that assistance offered?
I told Mr. Dingman that if he had his attorney's phone number, that we would be more than happy to contact him. He told us that it was in his cell phone. He did give me consent to look in the cell phone. I turned it on, it powered on fine. Mr. Dingman gave me the passcode to get into his phone, which was a design. We then looked through the phone contacts for his attorney, who he stated the name was Kill Bill, for a few minutes. And then Mr. Dingman decided that the attorney's phone number was not in the phone. So it was then turned back off.
So was at the time that then you were attempting to assist him, there's still battery on the phone?
Yes.
Now, during the course, or at some point, and perhaps you can help provide us information as to when, did items from Mr. Dingman's person end up on a table in the interview room?
They did.
When in the course of the interview did that occur?
At the beginning of the interview, Detective Sergeant Spence asked Mr. Dingman to empty the contents of his pockets out onto the table.
And among the contents that were emptied onto the table, was there a banana?
There was.
And was there a pair of glasses?
Yes.
Now, during the interview, were you able to observe the clothing that Mr. Dingman was wearing?
I did.
And was there something that you took note of during the course of the interview that drew your attention about his clothing?
Yes, it appeared that some of his clothing did have what could be described as blood staining.
Do you remember what item of clothing or item particularly drew your attention?
The beanie winter cap that he had on had what appeared to be a larger red stain on it. Also, his tennis shoes appeared to have blood splatter. Also, his hands and some of the items which he set on the desk.
Were the glasses among those items that
Yes,
appeared to have blood on them?
Yes.
Thank you. I have no further questions for you at this time, but Mr. Weesey may.
Thank you. Detective Mail, can you hear me okay?
You're a little muffled, but I can, yes.
Is this any better?
That's better.
All right. First of all, was this interview of Ethan, does this constitute your entire participation of the investigation in this case?
Yes.
And you wrote a 6-page report. Looks like it was dictated on 11/21, printed on December 5th of 2019. Would that be the only report that you generated in this case?
That would be correct, yes.
Okay. And so the genesis of your involvement in this situation was you were called by Chief Brinker along with Detective Sergeant Spence for the purpose of talking with Mr. Dingman.
Correct. The Major Crime Task Force was activated, and being a detective, I'm part of that. And so the investigators were called out to assist Coleman Police Department.
Okay. And so when you arrive, you have a conversation with Chief Brinker? Is that the first thing that happens?
Yeah, it was myself, Chief Brinker, Detective Sergeant Spence. I believe Trooper Bruises was there, just to kind of get an idea of what was happening and what the crime scene appeared to look like, what the nature of the call was.
And how long were you at the crime scene before you left to go back to the administrative building for the purpose of this conversation?
I can't give you an exact time frame. I would say half an hour to 45 minutes.
Okay.
It wasn't an extended period of time.
Sure. Okay. And based upon this meeting of the minds at the crime scene, if I understand your testimony, it was decided that Mr. Dingman was going to be transported to the sheriff facility for a voluntary statement. That's correct?
That's correct.
And you used the word witness on direct examination, is that correct?
That's correct.
And so in your mind, you're under oath here and you're telling us that at that point in time, Ethan Dingman is merely a witness to you and not a suspect in any way, shape, or form.
I can tell you at that point in time, any evidence that we may have would not lead us to believe, we would not be able to prove that he is a suspect. So therefore, he starts out as a witness, correct?
And that was communicated to you specifically by Chief Brinker.
What was communicated to me?
That we don't have, because you've been there for less than a half hour, and he's been there all morning, and you guys are having this meeting, and Chief Brinker says, hey, look, we got this Ethan Dingman guy, he called 911, but we don't have any evidence to arrest him. We don't have, probable cause to make an arrest. He's just a witness. Why don't you guys go take him down for a voluntary statement? Is that the conversation you had with Chief Brinker before you took Ethan Dingman to the sheriff's department?
Pretty much.
Okay. If you had to change it by adding something to it or taking something out of it, what would you add or take out?
Take out of what?
My synopsis of the conversation that I just walked through.
Well, we did look at the crime scene. We did see the victim laying on the floor. Ethan Dingman was the only person there. He was the 911 caller. He approached the trooper. At that point, we did not have anyone else to talk to or anyone else who we believe to be involved, either as a witness or as a suspect.
So if Chief Brinker has already indicated under oath here today that at the onset or early on in the stages of his interaction at the scene, he was getting calls from a number of victims, or I'm sorry, a number of witnesses. That was something that was not discussed during this meeting at the scene that you participated in?
Initially, no. When we arrived, Ethan Dingman was the person there. Whether or not Chief Brinker received calls from other witnesses after we left, it is unknown to me.
Well, yeah, I'm focusing on what Chief Brinker expressed to you at this initial meeting, not anything after. I'm talking about your time, your mental state when you left the scene.
Mr. Dingman, can you hear us? Okay, good. All right, go ahead.
So please answer in that context.
Yes, when I arrived, Ethan Dingman was in the rear seat of the patrol car. We went through the crime scene, and we left and went to the sheriff's department to interview him. I was under the impression he was giving a voluntary statement.
That's helpful, and that's what you did. I'm probing an area of what Brinker expressed to you in that briefing when you arrived on scene. Did Brinker advise you that there were a number of other witnesses that were going to need to be interviewed? Yes or no?
I don't recall that, no.
Did Brinker advise you that there were a number of other witnesses who had called him throughout the morning? Yes or no?
I don't recall that.
Okay. And did Brinker tell you that after his first 15 minutes or less conversation with Mr. Dingman, he had his guy, or he had his suspect, he just wasn't 110%? Did he say anything along those lines?
I don't recall him making that statement to me, no.
Okay. And so who was it that made the decision or the determination that Mr. Dingman wanted to go make a voluntary statement to you?
That's what I was told. I'm assuming Mr. Dingman says it was a voluntary statement.
My question was by who?
By Chief Brinker.
So Brinker decides that Dingman wants to make a voluntary statement, and he conveys that to you.
He conveyed that to me. Who decided that he wanted to make a voluntary statement? voluntary statement would tell me that Ethan Dingman decided that.
So you're guessing that Ethan Dingman said to Brinker, I want to go make a voluntary statement.
That's what voluntary statement is to me, yes.
But you're guessing that's what Dingman told Brinker.
That's what I was told.
You were told by Brinker that Dingman specifically told him he wanted to go make a voluntary statement.
I was told by Chief Brinker that Ethan Dingman was going to be interviewed. I was told that it was a voluntary statement.
Okay. And so did you ask Brinker if Ethan Dingman gave consent to be taken to the sheriff's department and gave consent to give a voluntary statement?
I did not ask him that, no.
Did you ask Dingman those questions?
No. When we arrived in the interview room, Ethan Dingman did not express any desire to leave. And at the point at which he did, we attempted to locate his lawyer for him.
We're going to get to your helpfulness in searching the phone in a minute. But prior to that, when you arrive at the sheriff's department, it's you and Spence and you take Ethan into this interview room, yes?
Correct. Myself, Detective Sergeant Spence, and Ethan Dingman were in the interview room.
Okay. And up in your mind, did you know throughout the morning if Ethan had been given any food, given any water, had an opportunity to use the bathroom facilities?
I do not know. I did not know.
Didn't make any inquiries along those lines?
He did not make any statements and he needed any of that.
That's helpful, sir. My question was to you. Did you make any inquiries along those lines?
I did not.
Okay. And did you have any information about his education level?
No.
His history or experience in dealing with the police or law enforcement?
No. This was the first time I've ever met Mr. Dingman was that morning.
Did you make any inquiries prior to having this conversation with Mr. Dingman?
No.
Okay. And you certainly didn't read Mr. Dingman his Miranda warnings.
Correct. It was a voluntary statement.
Right. And you didn't tell him he was free to leave.
I did not know.
No reason to, right? Because it's a voluntary statement, right?
Correct.
Okay. And he's just a witness, right?
Correct. At that point, he was a witness.
And this is what Brinker had told you, right?
Correct.
Okay. And Dingman never expressed any of those things to you, did he?
That he wanted to leave or needed something to drink or to use the restroom? No.
Or that he wanted to talk to you voluntarily or consented to the conversation?
He did not make that statement one way or the other, no.
How long did the interview take place?
The interview, refer to my notes, started at the interview ended approximately 1:30-ish, and probably started 9:30, 10 o'clock. I don't have the exact time for you.
And was Mr. Dingman placed under arrest immediately at the conclusion of the interview?
He was not.
How much time lapsed between, when was Mr. Dingman placed under arrest?
The information which we gathered from the interview was provided to the St. Joseph County prosecutor. The St. Joseph County prosecutor then decided that we had enough probable cause to place Ethan Dingman under arrest. At that point, he was advised he was being placed under arrest.
At what time was that?
1:30.
13:29?
Correct.
And what time did the interview end?
Just a few minutes before that, long enough to have a conversation. As I told you, I don't recall and I don't have the exact time.
More than 5?
I would estimate around 5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay. So at the conclusion of the interview, you call the prosecutor's office, have a very short conversation. You place Mr. Dingman under arrest. Fair to say?
No, the prosecutor was at the St. Joseph County Sheriff's Department.
Okay, so you had an in-person conversation, then you placed Mr. Dingman under arrest. Fair to say?
Correct, yes.
And then and only then is Mr. Dingman read his Miranda warrant.
Correct.
And there's audio recording of this interview, yes?
There's video recording of the interview. Once the interview was concluded, Detective Sergeant Spence attempted to burn the interview to a DVD. That is when he discovered that there were some technical issues with the audio recording inside of the room.
What technical issues existed inside of the room?
I do not know. It is not my interview room. It's at the Sheriff's Department. That is just what I was told.
Just to clarify, the prosecuting attorney at that time was John McDonough, is that correct?
That's correct, Your Honor.
And that's part of why we have a special prosecutor here today. We have a new prosecutor, Mr. David Marvin, and this would have been under the previous administration, as I understand. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
And is it fair to say during your conversation with Mr. Dingman, his mood would change greatly?
Yes.
His physical demeanor and mannerisms would change greatly?
Yes.
From peaceful to combative?
Yes.
From cooperative to uncooperative?
Yes.
Fair to say that these changes were random or appeared to be random to you?
Yes.
Fair to say he made a number of statements that did not make any logical sense to you?
Yes.
Fair to say that Ethan would also go off on tangents that were completely unrelated to any question that you posed to him?
Yes.
Let's talk about Bill Kill Bill, the lawyer. So at some point in the questioning, Mr. Dingman says, I want a lawyer.
Yes.
How far into the questioning did he make that comment?
Towards the end.
And you informed Ethan that you would be happy to contact his attorney for him, right?
Correct.
And Ethan had a cell phone, right?
Correct.
Was the cell phone seized or in your possession at the time of Mr. Dingman wanting to speak to his attorney, or was the cell phone still in his possession?
The cell phone was sitting next to him on the desk.
So instead of just saying, Mr. Dingman, I'm going to step out of the room here to allow you to make a phone call, to call your attorney, what is it that you did to help this witness locate his attorney?
I told him that I would look through his contacts for the number so we could call his attorney.
You told him that?
Told him that I could assist him with finding his attorney's number by looking through the contacts. Yes.
Why wouldn't you just allow him to do so, sir?
I don't know. I just didn't.
Well, the answer is you wanted to flip through his cell phone and take a look in his cell phone. Isn't that correct?
That's not correct. We would get a search warrant for that.
You would need a search warrant for that. But if you're just helping him find an attorney, you don't need a search warrant.
He gave me consent.
What was the wording of his consent?
I don't recall the exact wording.
Did you use one of those consent forms or have him sign off on a consent form?
No.
Why would you need a search warrant if you offered consent?
Consent was merely to find his attorney's phone number. It was not for any further search through the phone.
At the beginning of the interview, it's my understanding you had Mr. Dingman empty his pocket.
Correct. Detective Sergeant Spence did.
What was the purpose of that?
It's just standard operating procedure in most departments.
The standard operating procedure of you and your department before conducting a voluntary statement with the witness to have them empty their pockets?
Depends on what type of crime. Yes.
And that would be a written procedure in your training manual?
Would be a common sense procedure.
Common sense procedure? Well, you knew that Mr. Dingman had been secured in Chief Brinker's patrol car for a couple of hours prior to being, and you also knew that Brinker transported him to the jail, right? Or to the facility, the administrative side of the facility, right?
Correct.
You knew he had been in the custody and control of law enforcement for a couple of hours, and it included having been transported in one of their cars before you dealt with him, correct?
Correct.
Didn't common sense lead you to believe that any necessary protective measures would have been taken up to that point? I mean,
I don't like to assume that things have been done that I have not witnessed.
well, that's
Just
not
when it
true
comes to
now,
something
sir,
like
is it? That's not true now, sir, because you certainly assumed that Mr. Dingman gave a voluntary, he was here to voluntarily speak with me. I'm not going to check out anything with respect to his mental state, education, history. I'm not, don't care, doesn't matter to me. Chief Brinker says he's here to talk voluntarily. I'm assuming he made this statement, he's here to talk voluntarily. Isn't that what you testified to about 10, 15 minutes ago?
I testified that Chief Brinker said he wanted to give a voluntary statement.
Didn't you say that you assumed that Dingman must have said that to him then, to Brinker?
Correct.
Well, so it's safe to assume things when they fit your needs, i.e., we don't need to read this gentleman his Miranda warnings, but yet it's also fair for you to make assumptions the other way when maybe we want to do a search without a search warrant or going through Miranda warnings. Isn't that what's going on here, Detective?
No.
Explain it to me then. What's the difference between those? What's the difference in those two scenarios?
I don't understand your question.
Yeah. So you made assumptions that Ethan was there to make a voluntary statement. You based those assumptions on Brinker's statement to you. Yes?
Chief Brinker told me that, yes.
Yes. Is that a yes?
Chief Brinker made that statement to me, yes.
Okay. And you made the assumption then that it was true.
I know Chief Brinker, yes, and I do not know him as someone who would tell me something that is not true.
Okay. So you were safe in making the assumption that you didn't need to Mirandize Mr. Dingman based upon the statements of Chief Brinker. Yes?
Based on his statements that Ethan Dingman was giving a voluntary statement, yes, I did not feel that we needed to Mirandize him.
Right. Okay. So that's an apple. Now the orange. We got a witness that's been in the care and control of custody of Brinker for a couple of hours, transported from a scene to your location by Brinker himself. And what is it that you do with this witness? You have them empty as pockets. And why? You just testified because you don't make assumptions. So justify those two things for me, sir.
Because no one told me that they had searched his person or if he had any weapons on him, and I did not see anyone check him for weapons.
Did you ask Brinker if those things had been done?
I did not.
During your initial meeting with Chief Brinker, did he give you reason to be concerned about the mental health of Mr. Dingman?
Yeah, he did. He stated that Mr. Dingman, he has known him in the past. I don't recall his exact statement. I don't recall his exact statement.
Thank you, Your Honor. I have nothing further at this time.
Anything further, Ms. Shepherd?
No, thank you, Your Honor.
All right, Detective Mills, do you wish to stay or wish me to release you?
I'll stay.
All right, I'll mute your mic. Thanks.
Thank you.
Ms. Shepherd?
Thank you, Your Honor. At this time, the people have no further witnesses. What we would do, though, is move to admit the two reports that have also been stipulated to by the parties, the People's Exhibit 13 and People's Exhibit 14. People's Exhibit 13 is Michigan State Police Laboratory Report, numbered Lab Report number 3. Then People's Exhibit 14 is also Michigan State Police Lab Report, report number 5. Those are both admissible pursuant to MCL 766.11B for the purposes of preliminary examination.
I understand there's no objection at any rate, but there is a special rule, Mr. Dingman, for preliminary examination where laboratory reports can be admitted just for preliminary examination purposes without further foundation other than the report. So under that rule, which she cited, 766.11B, I will admit exhibit number 13, which is dated December 4th, 2019. And that's by Paul Donald, forensic scientist of the biology unit. And it's date completed March 9th, 2020. Exhibit number 5 is a report dated December 4th, 2019, completed May 26th, 2020. It's by Michelle Schmidt, M-I-C-H-E-L-L-E, S-C-H-M-I-T-T, a forensic scientist at the biology unit at the Michigan State Police Crime Laboratory. So 13 and 14 are admitted. Anything further?
No, we have no further witnesses. The people rest at this time. Thank you, Your Honor.
Mr. Weesey?
No proofs, Your Honor. Thank you.
Motion and argument?
Thank you, Your Honor. At this time, the people do move for bind over for the sole charge listed in the complaint in this matter for open murder. As the court is well aware, the people's burden during a preliminary examination is to provide that there's probable cause that the crime occurred and probable cause that the defendant is the individual who committed that crime. Starting with that first person, probable cause that a crime occurred, it is the people's responsibility to show that Mr. Schwartz's death was caused by another, that the offender intended to kill, cause great bodily harm, or knowingly created a very high risk of death or great bodily harm through their actions. And we do have evidence through that. We have the testimony of Dr. Joyce DeYoung regarding the nature of the injuries in this case. She indicated that they were blunt force injuries as well as injuries consistent with strangulation. She described the injury with the laceration to the back of the head, which would have been a forceful impact against something, perhaps from a fall, perhaps from being pushed down, with then the front of his brain being bruised as a result of the force of that impact to the back of the head, it traveling forward to the front of the head. The petechiae that were present in the mucous membranes of his eyes, of his mouth, on his face, as well as the ligature marks that were present on his neck for the purpose of the strangulation. She said that the petechiae in particular, while they can present as a result of many different things that cause high levels of pressure, that strangulation is one of these things that cause a high amount of pressure. And knowing the type of force or impact, the reasonable inference from that would be that a person would be doing this intentionally or knowingly create a very high risk of either death or great bodily harm in order to inflict those type of injuries. Additionally, we have this is the evidence that goes towards the fact that this death was a death that does meet the elements of the open murder in this case. Now, the question that really I think before the court is there probable cause that Mr. Dingman is the individual who's responsible for this? Dr. DeYoung's testimony was that where this laceration was, that there's a profuse amount of blood vessels there that can cause a significant amount of bleeding. The testimony we had from various witnesses that Mr. Schwartz was found in a pool of blood in the garage at his location, and that in addition to that pool of blood, there were also footmarks left in the pool of blood. We have, based on the interview with Detective Males, as well as the Detective Sergeant who was present with him but did not testify today, but Detective Males indicated that he observed on Mr. Dingman that there was blood on the glasses that were set on the table, as well as on the footwear that he was wearing, which are the court can view in People's Exhibit 5, Exhibit 6, and Exhibit 7. There's blood on the other side, underside of the shoe, on the shoelaces present there. In addition to that, there's blood present in People's Exhibit 8 on the eyewear. That's in People's Exhibits 8 and 9 of the glasses that were located, that we had then later testimony appeared to be similar to the glasses that were worn by the victim, Mr. Schwartz, in People's Exhibit number 2. On People's Exhibit 10, the pants that Mr. Dingman was wearing, there is clear some sort of staining on those clothes that are visible to the naked eye. And ultimately, these items were sent to the Michigan State Police Forensic Laboratory for evaluation. Each of these items were evaluated for the possibility of there being some sort of DNA evidence on them. Each of them were identified as items that potentially did have DNA items on them, and which was indicated in People's Exhibit 13. People's Exhibit 14 then does go on to show that these items that Mr. Dingman was either wearing or had in his possession did, in fact, there's a very strong likelihood or very strong support for the finding that Mr. Schwartz's DNA is on them. So Mr. Schwartz's DNA is found on Mr. Dingman's pants, on the shoes that he's wearing, on the shirt that he's wearing, on the glasses that were found on his person. Additionally, we had testimony that the house was locked, that keys were found outside of the house, but that when they did a search of the inside of the house, there were some yellow bananas that were located there. Also located on Mr. Dingman's person was a similar type of yellow banana. Those are visible in People's Exhibit 12, are the bananas that were located in the house, as well as in People's Exhibit, bear with me, Exhibit 4, the banana that was found on Mr. Dingman's person, or that he left there on the table while in the course of this investigation. All of these circumstances, in addition to the fact that Mr. Dingman was the only person who was found on scene when the police first arrived, they arrived within a minute of being dispatched to this call that was made from the Shell gas station. He was the only person who was there on scene. He also then was telling detective stories that continued to change, and that also board later found to be not true. He told Detective Nails, as well as the other detective who was present with him, that he had not, as well as Chief Brinker, that he had not gone to Todd Schwartz, that he had not touched him, that he hadn't gotten close to them, he didn't render aid. There was no, he didn't have contact with him.
Stop. I'm not sure that's in evidence. Did Detective Nails testify to that?
That Mr. Dingman did not render aid? Yes, I believe he did. I believe that it was right after Mr. Weesey made an objection or wanted to clarify something, and then I had to go back and re-ask Mr. Mills a question, or Detective Mills a question.
Asked if he attempted to help Schwartz, was a lot of blood and he did not want to touch it. Said his cell phone had no power. All right, so he makes an exculpatory statement. All right. I have some sincere reservations about the voluntariness of any statements made by Mr. Dingman at the Sheriff's Department, but we'll get to that. All right, I'll allow you to continue.
Thank you. In addition to the statements made at the Sheriff's Department, we also did have the statements that Chief Brinker indicated that Mr. Dingman made to him, that he did not go in more than a step or two, and again, that he didn't touch anything, he had no contact or anything. We know this simply is not true based on the evidence that then was obtained from his clothing, the fact that he is covered in Mr. Schwartz's DNA, that he in fact was there in a place that was profuse with the blood of Mr. Schwartz because of the injury that was present in the back of his head, this injury that was intentionally inflicted, that was one of the causes of his ultimate death. So for all of these reasons, when you take the totality of these things into consideration, we do believe that people have met their burden of proof that there is probable cause that Mr. Dingman was responsible for the death of Mr. Schwartz. And so for those reasons, we do ask that you bind this matter over to circuit court. Thank you.
What do you mean when you say he was covered with Mr. Schwartz's DNA?
So when we go to the Michigan State Police Laboratory reports, first of all, in report 3, it indicates what they were looking for to see if there was any possibility for DNA testing to come back. And so, for example, the pants, it says that there's apparent stains noted after visual examination. We can also see that from the photographs that are present. In regards to if we go a little bit further down, the glasses that had been emptied from his pockets, they indicate the possible presence of blood. That's also visible in the photographs that the people have admitted. And then also this hemosticks of the shirt indicate the possible presence of blood. Again, that I don't believe that the photos make it visually evident, but the testing that was done at the Michigan State Lab report indicated that there was a possible presence of blood on this. And then we also have Mr. Dingman's buccal swabs that were taken by Deputy Hughes during the course of the investigation. When we switch then to the Michigan State Police Lab Report 5, People's Exhibit 14, we then find out the result of that DNA testing. So the hypothesis when it came into the shoe swab, or the ultimate conclusion from the shoe swab, is that the analysis provided very strong support that Todd Schwartz is the contributor to the DNA profile developed from the shoe swab. These are the shoes that Mr. Dingman was wearing that from just the eye looking at it appeared to have blood on it, that the testing that MSP did in lab report 3 indicated there was potentially blood on it, and in fact it was there. And again, the officers testified that while on scene, they did see what appeared to be shoe impressions in this area where there had been blood in the garage as well. This puts Mr. Dingman at the scene then in the presence of Mr. Schwartz when he's there, profusely bleeding from his head from these inflicted wounds. Similarly, the pants that were tested in the next line, it provides, there's a mix of the DNA there. It provides very strong support that Ethan Dingman is the contributor to the DNA. They're on his pants. But then also in the second portion, the analysis provides very strong support.
It's very difficult to determine. I read these during lunch. To your credit, you sent them up this morning. Otherwise, they were just admitted like 2 minutes ago. It's difficult to match each item to each report without a careful cross referencing.
And that's the purpose of the stipulation between the parties at the beginning, that the items described in People's Exhibits 13 and 14 are those same items that were recovered from Mr. Dingman during the course of the investigation.
Oh, well, for example, and we're looking at page 2 of exhibit number 5, the very first item. Hypothesis, GR 19712-10DA. Hypothesis, Ethan Dingman and one unrelated unknown contributor. Hypothesis 2, two unknown unrelated contributors. Ethan Dingman is excluded as a possible contributor to the DNA contained in the shoe swab. Then the next one, and again, you have to very carefully cross-reference it, 7142-13E, Todd Schwartz is a contributor to the DNA profile on the shoe swab. Interpretation from the pant swab was performed, assuming the DNA profile originated from 3 individuals